The deep indigo sky of Nytharis shimmered with bands of luminous auroras, shifting in mesmerizing waves above the towering bioluminescent trees. Callum Voss adjusted the strap of his satchel as he stepped onto the landing platform, his boots pressing against the smooth, dark stone. His heart pounded, though he kept his expression neutral. This was his chance at redemption, his opportunity to ensure that humanity's first real diplomatic exchange with the Vey'nari people would not end in disaster. He glanced at his reflection in the polished metal of the transport's hull. The same man stared back, sharp jawline, wavy dark hair that fell just past his ears and those mismatched eyes. One green, one steel gray. The scar along his left cheek had faded over the years, but the weight of past mistakes had not. A soft hum vibrated through the air as a figure approached, her form framed by the ambient glow of the surrounding flora. Aelara Vey'nari moved with deliberate grace, her violet skin shimmering subtly under the light. Her silver-white hair was intricately braided, draping over her shoulders like woven silk. As she stepped closer, Callum caught the faint iridescent swirl in her black eyes, the galaxies shifting as she regarded him. "You are Callum Voss," she said, her voice smooth, resonant, and calm. It wasn't a question, but a statement. Callum gave a slight nod. "That's me." Aelara's bioluminescent markings pulsed in a slow rhythm, glowing faintly in the dim light. "It is an honor to receive you," she said, stepping forward with a poised confidence. She reached out her hand, and Callum, instinctively assuming it was a handshake, extended his own. But instead of shaking his hand, she grasped it gently and pulled him closer. Callum barely had time to react before she leaned forward, pressing her forehead lightly against his, her breath warm against his skin. Her fingers traced along the side of his face, skimming just over his scar before following a deliberate path down to his collarbone. The glow of her markings intensified where they touched, his breath hitched, muscles tightening, but he forced himself to stay still. This wasn't aggression. This was something else. Aelara pulled back slightly, her gaze scanning his features as if measuring his reaction. "You did not expect this." Callum swallowed hard, keeping his voice level. "Not exactly." Her lips curved into something that wasn't quite a smile but held the shape of one. "Among my people, this is how we welcome those we seek to understand." Callum exhaled, releasing the tension in his shoulders. "And if you don't seek to understand someone," Aelara tilted her head, considering, "then we do not touch them at all." He didn't know how to respond to that, so he settled for a small nod. "Come," she said, turning smoothly and gesturing for him to follow. "The council is waiting." He fell into step beside her, the rhythmic pulse of her bioluminescent lines drawing his attention. They moved subtly in response to something unseen, possibly to her emotions. He wondered if she could sense his. They walked through the towering flora, the air filled with faint chimes of unseen creatures and the distant hum of energy coursing through the trees. The entire planet felt alive, as if it were breathing in tandem with the beings who called it home. "You carry a weight," Aelara observed, her tone neither accusing nor pitying. Callum turned his gaze forward. "Don't we all?" She studied him for a long moment before responding. "Some more than others." They approached an elegant structure, its arches fluid and organic as if it had been grown rather than built. As they neared, the doors slid open with a whisper, revealing a chamber where several Vey'nari figures stood waiting. Aelara stopped just before entering and turned to him. "The council will listen," she assured him, though there was something unreadable in her expression. "But whether they will trust, that is another matter." Callum met her gaze, determination settling in his chest. "Then let's give them a reason to." She held his stare for a fraction longer before nodding. As they stepped into the chamber, Callum squared his shoulders, knowing that the next moments would shape the future of their two species. The chamber was vast, its walls lined with cascading strands of bioluminescent vines that pulsed with a slow, rhythmic glow. The Vey'nari council stood in a semicircle, their violet skin illuminated by the ambient light. They were regal in their stillness, their silver and dark blue robes flowing like liquid starlight. Some observed Callum with curiosity, others with quiet skepticism. He had prepared for this moment, but the weight of it still pressed heavily on his chest. Aelara stepped forward, inclining her head. "Honored Council, I present Callum Voss of Earth, envoy and xenolinguist." The eldest among them, a Vey'nari with lines of glowing green tracing his face, lifted his chin. "Human." The word carried a neutral tone, but there was something behind it, something measured. "You come here with words of peace, but words alone are thin as breath." Callum clasped his hands behind his back. "Then I will offer more than words." The elder's eyes flickered toward Aelara, then back to him. "Speak then." Callum took a breath, carefully forming his response in the Vey'nari tongue. "Humanity has made mistakes, but we have also learned. We do not seek to take from you nor to impose upon your world. We only wish for understanding." The moment his words settled into silence, quiet murmurs passed between the counselors. Some tilted their heads in surprise, others remained unreadable. The elder lifted a hand, silencing them. "You have studied our language." Callum nodded. "I believe that understanding begins with listening." With learning. A younger counselor, a woman with dark, braided hair adorned in silver beads, stepped forward. "Then listen now, human. There are those among us who do not share your vision." Her gaze was sharp, unyielding. "They whisper that humans come with honeyed words but carry knives in their shadows." Callum did not flinch. "I understand their fear." Her lips pressed into a thin line. "Do you?" Before he could answer, a sudden tremor vibrated through the chamber floor. The vines lining the walls flared brightly, reacting to the disturbance. Aelara's gaze sharpened and she turned her head slightly, listening. Another tremor. Then in an instant the chamber doors burst open. A Vey'nari guard staggered inside, his breathing labored, his bioluminescent markings flickering erratically. "An explosion," he gasped. "The southern district." The council erupted into alarmed murmurs, and the elder raised a hand to silence them once more. His gaze locked onto Aelara. "Go. Assess the damage." Aelara inclined her head, already moving. Callum, without hesitation, followed. She cast him a glance as they exited the chamber, her pace brisk. "This is not your concern. It is if someone is trying to sabotage these talks." She didn't argue. The scent of burning foliage met them as they neared the southern district, the normally serene atmosphere of Nytharis disrupted by the acrid sting of smoke. The ground had been scorched in places, deep gashes torn into the terrain where something had detonated. Vey'nari citizens stood in clusters, their markings dimming in distress. Aelara crouched near the impact site, running her fingers over the charred earth. Her markings pulsed as she concentrated. This was deliberate. Callum studied the blast radius. The scorch pattern, the depth of the impact, this wasn't an accident. He had seen sabotage before, and this bore all the hallmarks of it. "They're trying to frame humans," he said grimly. "They want the council to see us as a threat." Aelara exhaled slowly, her jaw tightening. "The Zavani order." Callum frowned. "Who?" She rose to her feet, her expression unreadable. "A faction among my people. They believe our world should remain untouched, that outsiders bring only ruin." Callum's stomach twisted. He had studied Vey'nari history before coming here. Every first contact event had ended in isolation. Not because of hostility from the visiting species, but because of internal divisions within the Vey'nari themselves. "How far will they go to make sure these talks fail?" he asked. Aelara met his gaze, her dark eyes reflecting the glow of the burning embers around them. "As far as they must." A crackle sounded through the air, and both of them turned sharply as a distortion shimmered along the tree line. Then, movement. A figure darted through the foliage, barely visible against the shifting light. Aelara reacted instantly, surging forward with practiced agility. Callum followed, his pulse hammering as they pursued the shadow through the glowing underbrush. The ground shifted beneath them, the terrain subtly alive in ways Callum wasn't used to. He nearly stumbled, but Aelara moved seamlessly, weaving through the trees with effortless precision. The figure ahead reached a ridge, pausing for only a second before turning back, a flash of violet skin, a face partially masked. Then the figure raised an arm. Callum barely had time to shout before the projectile fired. Aelara twisted, grabbing Callum's arm and yanking him sideways just as a sharp energy blast scorched the air where they had been standing. They tumbled behind cover, and Callum felt the heat pass too close for comfort. He caught his breath, looking at Aelara. Their faces were close, too close. He could see the way her markings glowed faintly, the way her breathing had quickened. He could feel the tension between them, more than just the aftermath of the chase. Aelara's fingers lingered on his wrist for a fraction longer than necessary. Then she pulled away. "They won't stop," she murmured. Callum exhaled sharply, his own pulse still racing. "Then neither will we." The night air remained charged, the pulse of danger thrumming beneath Callum's skin. Aelara moved first, rising smoothly from where they had taken cover, her eyes locked on the distant point where their attacker had vanished. The undergrowth still trembled in their wake, bioluminescent leaves curling from the residual heat of the energy blast. Callum pushed himself up, his breath steadying. "They didn't try to kill us." Aelara's gaze flicked to him. "You are certain?" He nodded. "That shot was meant to force us back. If they wanted us dead, they wouldn't have fired while we were moving. They wanted us to see them, to know they're watching." Aelara exhaled through her nose, sharp and controlled. "Then they are not merely saboteurs, they are testing us." Callum turned his attention back to the ridge where their attacker had disappeared. If the Zavani order was watching, it meant they hadn't yet committed to an all-out assault. They wanted to gauge the Council's reaction, to see if the explosion was enough to tip the balance in their favor. "If we go back to the Council now," he said, "we'll only be confirming their worst fears. A human envoy arrives and within hours there's an attack. They'll see a pattern even if it's not real." Aelara was already a step ahead of him. "Then we need proof. Evidence of Zavani involvement before the Council makes its decision." Callum glanced toward the path their attacker had taken. "And I'm guessing they won't be handing it to us." Aelara's lips pressed into something that might have been amusement, but it vanished as quickly as it appeared. "No. We must take it." They moved quickly, navigating the terrain with growing synchronization. Aelara led with instinct, following the subtle disturbances in the bioluminescent flora, bent stems, footprints too deep for native wildlife. Callum followed close behind, his mind working through the probabilities, cataloging details, predicting the enemy's next movement. Aelara paused near a cluster of whispering reeds, her hand raised in a silent command for Callum to stop. He obeyed without question, watching as she crouched low, her fingers tracing the air in front of her. "There is an energy signature here," she murmured. Callum frowned. "A cloaking field," she nodded. "Weak but deliberate. The Zavani do not use human technology, which means they're nearby." A faint sound, a shift in the wind, too rhythmic to be natural, reached Callum's ears. His body tensed, instincts firing. Without thinking, he grabbed Aelara's wrist and pulled her down just as a figure materialized from the haze, stepping out of the thin air like a ghost. The Zavani operative barely had time to react before Aelara moved. She struck first, fluid and precise, her hand darting forward to disable the device at the figure's belt. A flicker of distorted light pulsed outward, revealing the operative's full form. A Vey'nari male, his features hard with conviction. Callum lunged before the operative could recover, twisting his wrist into a hold that forced his attacker off balance. The man hissed in pain, struggling, but Callum kept his grip firm. "We're not here to fight you." The operative's gaze burned into him. "You are not meant to be here at all." Aelara stepped closer, her voice cold. "Then tell me why my people were almost killed tonight." The operative's jaw tightened. "Because they refused to see the truth." His gaze flicked toward Callum, filled with unmasked disdain. "You bring your kind here and they will take everything. They always do." Callum could hear the belief in his voice, the unshakable certainty of someone who had already decided the future. "You don't know that." The operative laughed, sharp and humorless. "Don't I? What happened to the Anshori, the Ralathek? Every species your people have befriended. Where are they now?" Callum didn't have an answer. He knew humanity's history wasn't spotless, that there were mistakes, conflicts, failures. But that wasn't why he was here. Aelara's voice was measured, but there was an edge beneath it. "This is not the way to protect our people." The operative's markings pulsed once, then dimmed. "It is the only way." A second later, he twisted sharply, breaking free from Callum's grip. He moved fast, too fast. By the time Callum turned, the man had vanished into the undergrowth, the cloaking field reactivating around him. Aelara cursed in Vey'nari, something low and vicious. Callum exhaled, rolling the tension from his shoulders. Well, that could have gone better. Aelara shot him a look that was equal parts exasperation and something else, something unreadable. Then, to his surprise, she smirked. A bold statement from someone who let him escape. Callum huffed. "I didn't let him." He stopped, catching the glint of something on the ground. His eyes narrowed as he bent down, picking up the small device the operative had dropped in his struggle. It was a data module. Aelara leaned in beside him, her shoulder brushing his. "You are either very lucky or very skilled." Callum looked at her, feeling the sudden closeness between them. The soft glow of her markings reflected in his mismatched eyes. Maybe both. For a moment, neither of them moved. The world around them remained still, waiting. Then Aelara took the data module from his hand, her fingers brushing against his for the briefest second longer than necessary. "Come," she said, turning away. "Let us see what secrets our friend left behind." Callum followed, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something between them had shifted. And for the first time since arriving on Nytharis, he wasn't sure what that meant. The data module hummed lightly in Aelara's palm as they made their way back through the dense underbrush, the shadows of the forest seeming to deepen with every step they took. Aelara's markings flared briefly, her body moving with practiced grace, but Callum couldn't ignore the subtle tension in the air between them. There was something about the way she had held onto the module just a little longer than necessary, something about the way their hands had brushed. He pushed the thought away, focusing instead on the task at hand. The Zavani operative had left something behind, a clue, a piece of the puzzle that might lead them to the truth. They had to find out what it was before the council made any decisions. When they reached the edge of the forest, the dense flora opened up to reveal the hidden tech lab Aelara had led him to earlier. It was a quiet, secure place, away from prying eyes. The interior was bathed in soft white light, and various alien devices hummed quietly in their respective corners. Aelara moved with confidence, unlocking a panel in the wall and connecting the data module to a console. Callum leaned against the table, watching her work. Her fingers flew over the controls with an ease that suggested she had done this countless times before. "You always work alone?" Callum asked, trying to keep his voice casual. Aelara didn't look up as she typed. "Most of the time. And yet you brought me along." She paused, her fingers hovering over the console for just a moment. "You have a talent for picking things apart," she said without looking at him. "I've seen it already." There was something about the way she said it, something that made his heart beat just a little faster. He hadn't expected praise, but there was something in her tone that felt like more. "Figured I might be useful." Useful. She repeated the word with a hint of amusement, but the sound was quieter than before. She tapped a few more keys and a window popped up on the screen, revealing a series of encrypted files. "This is it," she said, scrolling through the data. Evidence of their planned attacks on human settlements. They were going to frame us, make it look like we initiated hostilities. Callum leaned over her shoulder, studying the screen. "This is huge." Aelara glanced up at him, her face softening. "We need to take this back to the council, show them what we've found. It'll prove the Zivani Order's involvement." Callum frowned. "We can't just show them. We need to be careful. If they find out we're holding this, it might just make things worse." Her eyes met his, and for a moment the room seemed to hold its breath. "We'll be careful," she said, her voice steady. But there was a flicker of something else in her gaze, something unspoken, a trust, fragile but growing. Aelara quickly secured the files, encrypting them again before sliding the module into her pocket. She straightened and turned to face him. "Let's go." They left the lab together, walking side by side in silence. The stars above were clearer here, distant pinpricks of light against the inky expanse of space. As they made their way toward the council building, Callum's mind raced. They had the evidence, they had the truth, but the hardest part was still ahead, convincing the council to act. They reached the entrance to the council's main hall, and Aelara turned to him, her expression unreadable. "Are you ready for this?" she asked, her voice quieter than usual. Callum met her gaze, his heart pounding. He wanted to say something to ease the tension between them, something to bridge the gap that seemed to have widened in the past few hours. But the words didn't come. Instead, he nodded. "We'll do this together." Aelara's eyes softened slightly. "Together." The word hung between them as they stepped inside, the doors closing behind them. They had come this far. The next steps would determine everything, the future of the humans, the Vey'nari, and the fragile peace that still hung in the balance. The council was waiting. The council chamber was eerily quiet as Callum and Aelara entered, the soft hum of the ambient lighting creating an almost oppressive stillness. The elder from earlier, the one with the glowing green lines on his face, was seated at the center of the large oval table, his piercing gaze fixed upon them as they approached. The other counselors were spread out around him, each one watching with an air of quiet expectation. Aelara moved to stand beside Callum, her posture poised, though Callum could sense the tension radiating from her. She was prepared, but the weight of what they were about to reveal was not something even she could brush aside. He could feel it too, the pressure to make this moment count. The elder spoke first, his voice deep and unwavering. "Aelara Vey'nari, Callum Voss, you returned swiftly, which can only mean you have something to show us." Aelara's gaze never wavered as she stepped forward. "We do, elder. The Zivani Order's plan to sabotage our peace talks." She nodded toward Callum, signaling for him to present the evidence. Callum stepped up, his heart pounding, but he kept his voice steady. "We've uncovered information, proof, that members of the Zivani Order have orchestrated the explosions, intending to frame humanity for acts of aggression. They meant to disrupt the talks and escalate tensions between our species." The elder's eyes flickered briefly, and his bioluminescent markings pulsed once, as if in response to Callum's words. The other counselors remained still, but their quiet murmurs betrayed their growing unease. Callum placed the data module on the table in front of him, pushing it toward the center. He could feel the weight of their collective gaze on him, assessing, waiting. Aelara spoke again, her voice firm. "This data will show you the truth. The Zivani Order's involvement in the sabotage and their planned attacks on human settlements. They hope to start a war." The elder studied the module for a moment before nodding at one of the other counselors. "Process it," he said simply. The counselor who had been tasked with handling the module moved swiftly to a console at the side of the room, inserting the module and activating the screen. The room fell silent as the encrypted data began to unfurl. The details of the plot came to light, revealing the full extent of the Zivani Order's conspiracy. The visual data confirmed it: explosive devices placed at strategic points, coded messages between the operatives, and even instructions for framing humans for the attack. Callum could see the shift in the counselors' expressions. Some exchanged looks, disbelief painted on their faces, while others simply observed with a calculating air. It wasn't enough to simply have the evidence. It was how they would react to it that mattered now. The elder remained silent, his gaze fixed on the data unfolding in front of him. When it finally finished, he exhaled slowly, his bioluminescent markings dimming for a moment. "This is damning." Aelara stood beside Callum, her posture stiff. "And yet it will not matter if you refuse to act. If we do not stop the Zivani Order now, peace will not last. This world will fall into chaos, and humans will not be the only ones to suffer." One of the younger counselors, a woman with deep violet markings, spoke up, her voice laced with skepticism. "But the Zivani Order is not a small faction, Aelara. They are entrenched within the heart of our society. Their influence is vast." Callum met her gaze directly. "It doesn't matter how large they are. The truth is the truth. If you allow this to continue, the peace will be shattered by lies." The elder's gaze flickered from the data screen to Callum, then to Aelara. "You ask us to risk everything on this on a human." His voice was soft but edged with the weight of centuries of tradition. Aelara stepped forward, her voice unwavering. "It is not about the human. It is about the future of all of us. Our species will either rise together or we will fall apart. You have seen the evidence. You have seen the consequences of inaction. What will you choose?" For a long moment, there was only silence, the room thick with the weight of history and decision. Callum could feel his heart hammering in his chest, every breath tight as he waited for the council to make their move. Finally, the elder spoke, his voice carrying the authority of generations. "We will act. But know this will not be easy. The Zivani Order will not simply bend to our will. They will retaliate, and they will do so violently." Aelara nodded. "We are ready for that." The elder's eyes softened slightly, his gaze flicking to Aelara, then to Callum. "Very well. We will begin the process of arresting the Zivani leaders, but we will need your help, Callum Voss. Your skills, your knowledge of diplomacy. It is not enough to expose them. We must undo the damage they have done to our people. We must rebuild trust." Callum swallowed, the weight of the responsibility settling heavily on his shoulders. This was what he had come for, his chance to make up for his past mistakes. But the truth was that he hadn't been prepared for the full scale of what this would require. "I'll do whatever it takes," he said, his voice steady despite the storm of uncertainty brewing inside him. Aelara's gaze shifted to him, a quiet acknowledgement in her eyes. For a fleeting moment their gazes locked, the unspoken understanding between them growing. The trust they had built, however fragile, had just become something more. The elder nodded, signaling the end of the discussion. "Then it is decided. We will move forward with this plan. You, Callum Voss, will be integral to ensuring the survival of our peace." As the counselors began to discuss the logistics of the operation, Callum stood silently beside Aelara, his mind racing with the magnitude of what had just been set into motion. This was just the beginning. And somehow, in the midst of all of it, he knew his future with Aelara, was now tied to the outcome of this moment. The stakes had never been higher. The transport descended swiftly through the layers of Nytharis' atmosphere, cutting through the mist and light clouds that clung to the peaks of the planet's mountainous terrain. Callum's pulse quickened, his mind racing through the steps ahead. He'd faced high-stakes missions before, but this felt different. This wasn't just diplomacy, this was war. It wasn't just his life on the line anymore, it was Aelara's, and the future of two species. Beside him, Aelara's focus was unwavering, her sharp eyes fixed on the distant horizon, scanning for any signs of movement below. Her bioluminescent markings seemed to flicker in sync with the transport's hum, casting a soft glow over the cabin. She was in her element, but even so, Callum noticed the subtle tension in her posture. The closer they got, the more the pressure built between them. "We'll hit their comms relay first," Aelara said, breaking the silence. "It's the weakest link in their operation. Once we disable it, we'll disrupt their ability to coordinate with their forces." She glanced at him, her eyes sharp. "It's risky. There will be resistance." "I'm ready," Callum replied, his voice steady, though his mind was racing. He was ready for the fight, but more than that, he was ready for whatever came after. They hadn't talked much about the stakes beyond the mission, but he knew there was something more between them now. A bond that had formed in the quiet moments, the ones where their lives had collided. They were no longer just allies. They were something else entirely, and for the first time that truth felt clear to him. The transport dipped low, cutting through the thick tree canopy that surrounded the Zivani stronghold. Aelara's eyes flicked toward him, and she offered him a small, knowing smile, her expression both calm and determined. "We've got this," she said, her voice filled with quiet confidence. "Trust me." "I do," Callum responded without hesitation. The words came easy now, and the certainty behind them was more than just the mission. They were about something deeper, something that was unfolding between them, even in the midst of danger. The transport's landing gear touched down with a soft thud, the surrounding forest quiet except for the occasional rustle of leaves. Callum's breath caught as the hatch opened, revealing the jungle-like environment outside. The air was thick with moisture, but the scent of earth and alien flora was grounding. The silence was almost too complete, the calm before the storm. Aelara was already moving, her body a blur of swift, fluid movements as she dropped to the ground and moved toward the entrance to the relay station. Callum followed, his steps in sync with hers, his focus sharpened as he surveyed the area. They couldn't afford to be caught off guard. The comms relay was housed in a small, reinforced building, nestled between clusters of towering bioluminescent trees that cast an eerie glow in the otherwise dark landscape. The structure was heavily guarded, its walls bristling with defensive tech. Callum could feel the tension building in his chest. They were about to enter enemy territory, and everything rested on their ability to move undetected. Aelara glanced over her shoulder, catching his gaze. She gave him a quick nod before turning back to the mission, her movements as smooth and deliberate as ever. They were partners in this. She trusted him to do his part, and he trusted her to lead them through the worst of it. As they approached the building, Callum felt his pulse race. The sound of footsteps in the distance reached his ears, and instinctively he dropped to one knee behind a cluster of glowing foliage. Aelara crouched beside him, her sharp eyes scanning the path. 3 guards, all armed, she whispered. "I'll take the one on the left. You handle the one on the right. Keep it silent." He nodded, the weight of the responsibility settling on his shoulders. They couldn't afford to make a sound. Aelara moved first, her bioluminescent markings flaring brightly as she slipped from her cover, swift and lethal. She was a blur of motion, her hand clasping the guard's mouth before the man could even react, pulling him into a chokehold and dropping him to the ground silently. Callum followed her lead, using the environment to his advantage, slipping behind the second guard and disabling him quickly with a precise strike to the neck. They moved with synchronized precision, no wasted motion, no room for error. The third guard didn't even see them coming. Aelara reached him first, using a stun device to incapacitate him, her fingers swift and sure as she neutralized the threat. "Clear," Aelara said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. Callum exhaled, his heart pounding in his chest. They had made it this far. But the real challenge was still ahead. They had to infiltrate the relay station and take out the communications hub. Time was running out, and the Zavani order wasn't known for its mercy. They moved quickly into the building, the doors opening silently under Aelara's expert touch. Inside, the tech was as sophisticated as Callum had imagined. Sleek consoles lined the walls, their screens flickering with streams of data. The comms relay was at the center, its core protected by layers of security. Aelara immediately went to work, her fingers flying over the interface as she bypassed the first layer of encryption. Callum stood watch, his eyes scanning the room for any signs of trouble. They were close now, too close to fail. "You'll need a minute," Aelara murmured, her voice steady despite the pressure. "I'm ready," Callum replied. His eyes flicked to the console next to her, watching her work, admiring how she moved, confident, precise, and unshaken by the growing stakes. He could feel her tension just beneath the surface, but he could also feel the bond between them, unspoken yet undeniable. Whatever happened next, they were in it together. Aelara's hands paused, her fingers hovering above the interface. She looked up at him, her expression serious. "Once I pull this off, we'll need to move fast. They'll be on us the moment they realize what we're doing." "I'm ready," Callum repeated. She nodded, then turned back to the console, inputting the final commands. The relay station began to hum and the screens flickered, then went dark. Aelara smiled just slightly. "It's done. Let's go." Callum felt a rush of relief, but there was no time to savor the victory. They needed to leave, and fast. As they turned to head for the exit, the door slid open with a sharp hiss, and there, standing in the doorway, was the last person they expected to see. The Zavani leader, his face cloaked in shadows, was blocking their only exit. "Did you think you could just walk away?" he asked, his voice cold and filled with menace. The final confrontation had begun. The Zavani leader stood in the doorway, his figure imposing, almost surreal against the flickering lights of the comms room. His violet skin seemed to absorb the shadows, the faint pulse of his bioluminescent markings casting an eerie glow on his face. His eyes, dark and calculating, narrowed as they met Callum's. There was no surprise in his expression, just the cold assurance of someone who had expected this moment. Aelara's stance shifted, her body tensing in response. She was already calculating their options, but Callum could see the weight of their situation in her eyes. They had one exit, and the Zavani leader had just sealed it. "Did you think I wouldn't know?" The leader said, his voice smooth and venomous, the words hanging heavily between them. "You're not the first to try this, and you won't be the last." Aelara's gaze flicked to the door, then back to the leader. "You're wasting your time, you won't stop us." The Zavani leader tilted his head, almost as if considering her words. "Oh, I think I will." His eyes flicked to the side, and Callum's stomach dropped as he heard the faint sound of more footsteps, more guards closing in from behind. Callum's mind raced. They were trapped. Aelara could fight, but with the odds stacked so heavily against them, it would take a miracle to get out unscathed. His hand instinctively moved to the side, where the stun device Aelara had given him earlier was secured in his pocket. But even that wouldn't be enough against what was coming. "Move," Aelara said, her voice quiet but resolute. Without warning, she lunged forward, her movements fluid as she aimed for the leader. He reacted almost immediately, stepping aside with speed that seemed unnatural, blocking her strike with ease. Callum didn't hesitate. He drew the stun device, charging toward the group of guards that had begun to filter into the room. The energy burst from the device, hitting the first guard square in the chest. He dropped to the floor with a grunt, unconscious before he even hit the ground. Aelara's eyes met Callum's for a split second, a silent agreement passing between them. They were in this together, and they were going to fight their way out, no matter what it took. The Zavani leader's face twisted into a sneer. "You still don't understand," he said, his voice laced with both contempt and amusement. You've lost. The moment you decided to betray your own kind and trust a human, you sealed your fate. Aelara's expression hardened. You're wrong. She lunged again, her movements swift, but the leader caught her wrist mid-air, his strength far greater than she had anticipated. She gritted her teeth, twisting her body to break free, but he held firm. I've known many like you, the leader said, his grip tightening as he leaned in closer, his voice low and menacing. You'll fail just like all the others. Peace with humans is a fantasy. You'll see that soon enough. Callum moved again, this time toward the leader. He needed to get him away from Aelara, break his hold on her. But just as he took a step forward, another blast of energy shot from the door, hitting the wall near him, sending sparks flying. He staggered back, barely able to keep his balance. Aelara used the moment to twist out of the leader's grip, spinning to face him once more. No one tells me what I believe, she said, her voice tight with anger. Not you, not anyone. Callum was still reeling from the close call, but he didn't have time to think about it. He had to move. He threw the stunned device to the side and reached for the nearest weapon, a staff from one of the fallen guards. It wasn't ideal, but it would do. The Zavani leader smirked as he observed their struggle, his eyes gleaming with cruel amusement. You can fight all you want, but it won't matter in the end. He raised his hand, signaling for the guards to close in. That's when the unexpected happened. A sharp, resounding crack echoed through the room, followed by a low growl. The floor beneath them rumbled as the building's external doors shuddered and exploded outward. From the broken doors emerged a new presence, a massive creature, its shape almost too large to fit in the space. It was a Vey'nari beast, one that Aelara had described in passing but never in detail, a war beast trained for battle. It tore through the space with incredible speed, its eyes glowing with aggression. The guards scrambled back in panic, and the leader's confident sneer faltered. The creature's roar was deafening, and it barreled toward the leader, its massive jaws snapping just inches from his face. He barely managed to dodge, his expression now a mix of fury and disbelief. How? He spat, backing away from the beast, which turned its attention to the remaining guards. Aelara turned to Callum, her eyes wide with realization. It's a distraction. We have a chance to move. Callum didn't need any further urging. He sprinted toward her and they both bolted for the back exit, pushing past the chaos unfolding behind them. The creature was holding the Zavani leader's forces at bay, but they had no illusions about how long that would last. They had to get out, and they had to do it fast. As they reached the exit, Aelara paused, glancing back. We'll need to regroup. This isn't over. Callum nodded, his heart pounding in his chest. I know, but we've bought ourselves some time. Together they ran into the night, their minds already working on what came next. The fight wasn't over yet, and the path ahead was uncertain, but they had taken a step closer to victory. And in that moment, surrounded by the distant echoes of battle, Callum knew. Whatever happened next, they were in this together. The jungle night felt alive with the weight of their escape, the distant sounds of the battle still echoing in the distance as they sprinted through the underbrush. Callum's breath came in ragged gasps, his muscles burning from the exertion, but he couldn't stop. Not yet. Not until they were far enough away to regroup to think. Beside him, Aelara moved like a shadow, her every step measured and swift, her bioluminescent markings flickering in the low light like guiding stars. She didn't break stride, but Callum could see the tension in her shoulders, the way her jaw tightened with each step. They had barely escaped the Zavani stronghold, and the leader's cryptic words still hung in the air, gnawing at the edges of his thoughts. They won't stop, he murmured, more to himself than to Aelara. Not after this. Aelara shot him a glance, her eyes hard with resolve. They won't. But we've gained the upper hand, and that's what matters right now. Her voice was steady, but there was an underlying weight in it, an understanding of the cost of what they'd just done. They had disrupted their enemy's plans, yes, but now they were marked. The Zavani order would hunt them, and it was only a matter of time before their enemies came in full force. They reached a small clearing, the trees around them thickening into a dense wall of foliage. Aelara slowed, her posture relaxing slightly as they reached the relative safety of the open space. She turned to face him, her eyes scanning their surroundings. "We need to make contact with the council," she said, her voice quieter now, the urgency of the moment still lingering. "Let them know what happened. They'll need to prepare for what's coming." Callum nodded, though he felt the weight of exhaustion settling in his bones. He pulled the communicator from his belt, ready to make contact with the council, but Aelara stopped him, her hand on his arm. "Wait," she said, her tone shifting, a subtle tension creeping into her voice. "There's something else we need to consider first. The Zavani leader, he knows too much. He's not just some rogue operative. He's part of something bigger. We have to find out how far this goes. How deep the corruption runs." Callum's stomach tightened. He had suspected as much, but hearing it out loud made it all the more real. They weren't just dealing with a single faction trying to disrupt peace talks. The Zavani order had been manipulating things from the shadows, pulling strings, and likely had agents embedded within the council itself. "You think there's a mole?" he asked, his voice low. Aelara's gaze was distant, her mind already working through the possibilities. "I'm certain of it. The way they knew exactly where we'd strike, how prepared they were, it's more than just luck. There's someone feeding them information." Callum exhaled sharply, the weight of their next move pressing down on him. The last thing they needed was a traitor in their midst, someone who could undermine everything they'd worked for. It was the last piece of the puzzle they needed to solve before they could truly secure peace. "We can't go back to the council just yet," he said, his voice firm. "Not until we know who we're dealing with." Aelara met his gaze, her expression darkening with understanding. "You're right. We need to root out the traitor first. Then we'll take the fight to the Zavani. We'll expose them for what they really are." The decision was made, and with it, the course of action was clear. But the path ahead wasn't without its dangers. They were no longer just two people trying to stop an attack. They were now part of a much larger game, one where the stakes were higher than they had ever imagined. Aelara stepped forward, the light of the bioluminescent trees casting shifting shadows over her face. "We'll need to move fast. There's no time to waste, but we'll be careful. This next step, Callum, it's everything. We can't afford to make mistakes." He nodded, his resolve solidifying as the weight of the situation settled around him. They were in this together. Every step they took, every move they made would determine the future of not just their two species, but the fragile peace that hung between them. As Aelara began to scan the area for any sign of danger, Callum took a deep breath and reached for his communicator once more. They needed to find the mole, before the Zavani order could get to them first. Aelara's voice cut through the silence, soft but firm. "We'll get through this, Callum. We always do." His heart skipped a beat at the unwavering certainty in her words. It wasn't just hope. It was something deeper, a bond that had formed between them, built on trust and shared purpose. "We will," he agreed, glancing at her one